All right, so we will get started. If you're new to this class, it's fine. What we've been discussing is some of the attributes of God. I entitled the class, Who is God? And we're discussing attributes of God. Last week we talked about what's called aseity, God's aseity. If you were here last week and are still very confused about it or are new, basically just try to remember that what that means is that God is self-existent. God does not have like a cause outside of himself for his existence. As I think I quoted at, God is the only being whose reason for being is in himself. So that's what that is. So today we're going to dive into the next attribute of God, which is God's eternity. And what basically, this actually has a very simple definition. What we mean by God's eternity is that God has no beginning and God has no end. So first what I'm going to do is hand out worksheets. Adam's got pens. Again, these are for your own use. If you want to take notes, you don't have to take notes. There won't be a test other than the one Dave gives. So again, feel free. Now, before I get started, talking about some of these things, if you were here last week or if you're here now, some of these things can be sort of overwhelming, or if you feel overwhelmed thinking about these things, that's perfectly fine. You're never going to have like a complete, full understanding of this. Like you're not going to be able to fully comprehend eternity. I think it is beyond our scope. So if you're like laying in bed thinking about how can something exist forever, I've done that many times. Like I've just sat there and you just sort of get overwhelmed and sort of can have a headache or think your head's going to explode. Think about how something cannot have an end, how something cannot have a beginning. Don't worry. Like these things I don't think are fully comprehensible, but he can still help you to expand your image of God, like just sort of dwelling on it. And we can have like an informational comprehension. We can have like a sort of finite comprehension. Like we can still talk about it. Just like we may not fully understand how certain things in the universe work. You might not understand how the weather works, but sort of understanding a little bit more about a hurricane, even though you don't fully understand it, can sort of broaden your knowledge and your understanding. And for me personally, like dwelling on these things and learning about these things, I find it like incredibly enriching. I sort of think of that song we sing in church, like the song Hurricane, where it's saying about like God's love is like a hurricane and it just like overwhelms us. Now even more so I think about God being like so much greater than the actual universe, like that's full with these trillions of galaxies, and then put that behind his love. Like God's love is even more encompassing than the entire universe. So again, don't be overwhelmed, don't be discouraged if you don't understand these things. So like we did last week, we're going to go through the Bible verses that sort of point to God being eternal. Sort of start there, and then we'll get into our study of it. Again, I won't really expand too much on the verses. I think that they say things much more beautifully than I ever could. But I am going to read them and go through them. So we're going to start with Psalm 90. Again, I used the same verse last week, 1 through 4. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn man back into dust and say, Return, O children of men, for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it passes by, or as a watch in the night. So the key phrase I think in here is from everlasting to everlasting, beginningless to endless. And then we'll go to Psalm 102, verses 11 through 12. And again, this verse also, a lot of these verses compare our existence to eternal existence, that we are sort of fleeting. My days are like a lengthened shadow, and I will wither away like grass. But you, O Lord, abide forever, and your name to all generations. And so again, this compares us, that we are almost like, just like a passing sunset compared to God. Our life on this earth is so short, but yet his is like everlasting. And then in the same chapter, verses 25 to 27, of old you founded the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. Even they will perish, but you endure. And all of them will wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them, and they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will not come to an end. So again, a comparison of like to clothing, to things created, that these things pass away, but God endures forever. In that same vein, we'll go back to Psalm 90, verses 5 and 6. And he says that you have swept them away like a flood. They fall asleep, I think speaking about man. In the morning they are like grass which sprouts anew. In the morning it flourishes and sprouts anew. Toward evening it fades and withers away. So again, God's comparison to the creation, that even though the creation, the finite creation, in comparison to him is as nothing. And now I want to go to Job 36:26. Behold, God is exalted, and we do not know him. The number of his years is unsearchable. So then again, more biblical evidence for this attribute of being eternal. And then again, similar in Isaiah 41:4, who has performed and accomplished it, calling forth the generations from the beginning, the Lord, the first and the last. Now, another thing that the Bible sort of talks about and hints at, and I'm only going to read one verse, but this idea of God existing before even time began. There are like a number of verses that talk about this. I didn't highlight. Can you put the Jude 1:25 up? I didn't actually highlight it. To you, the only God, our Savior, through Jesus Christ our Lord, be glory, majesty, dominion, and authority before all time, and now, and forever. So the writer of Jude is actually saying, even before time began, all glory to God, and then in the present and in the future. Again, forever, eternal. Now, as I said before, the Bible isn't like a philosophy book, so when he says before all time, we don't mean before all time, because before is a word that only means anything in time. So there's a moment before time began. Now, these are the Bible verses I'm going to use. Does anybody want to add some other verses they can think of that expresses God's eternity, God's being infinite? If not, we'll dive into the philosophy of this concept. So, it's very well understood in Christianity through the scriptures that God is eternal. Now, what exactly, though, does that mean? Well, what does God being eternal mean? There are sort of two ways that it can be thought about, two ways that are sort of debated, two ways that are sort of discussed. And one is called that God could be omnitemporal. And then what this means is that omnitemporality is that God is existing infinitely throughout time. Like he is in time, but he has no beginning and no end. He exists within time. And you can think of time as like, we'll just represent time as a line. And I'm going to put two arrows. So like this is time. Now let's say this point right here is when I was born. So like 1981. Now, imagine this is all of time. God being omnitemporal, any mark we make, God exists. Any single mark, God is present, God is there. So even on my birthday, all the way back, all the way forward, that God is always there. Now, the other view, actually I'm going to leave that up, is called atemporal or atemporality. And that God exists is the view that God exists outside of time. That God is not within time. That God is just sort of permanent. He's always there outside of time. So in this view, God wouldn't be on this line. He would sort of be out here. Sort of, and time would be a separate entity. Like the space-time universe is a separate entity from God. So again, the Bible isn't really clear about which one of these things that God is. It gives hints to either way. So we're going to sort of discuss that. I like to sort of just give a quick overview of other religions and belief systems, and that, the monotheistic religions like Islam and Judaism sort of agree that God is eternal. The Muslim scholars haven't dived too much into this difference. They're starting to. They're sort of following suit with a lot of the Christian theologians in sort of researching this. In pantheistic religions, and I use that word a lot, pantheism, what pantheism actually means is pan is all and theism is God. So pantheism means like everything is God. So that includes a lot of the Eastern religions. They believe in an eternity, but they believe that existence is sort of eternal, and that we, being part of that nature and God, are also eternal. So before we dive into sort of these things, I want to ask, like, what people think. Like, what of these two views does anyone has anyone ever thought about it? Has anyone ever thought, like, they think that God exists outside of time, or they think that God is eternal within time? Or if you also don't understand what these two things mean, I'm fine with further explaining. Okay, so we're saying that God is eternal. The Bible says God is eternal, but it doesn't really explain what that means. And so what this is, omnitemporal, means that God is eternal within time, like he exists at every moment in time, that he is present throughout infinite time. Where atemporal means that God is like outside of time, like he's not in time, he's outside of time, and that time is just a quality of us, like this, and time passes, doesn't affect God. So that's sort of what the two, does that make sense? And Bill had a question?
Yeah.
Got to get the mic, Bill, unless it's quick.
I'll try to make it quick.
I get a headache from trying to comprehend eternity, and I can't. It's outside of I think the human.
Yes, I
brain
agree
to do
that it's outside
But
human understanding.
my question is, if we can't comprehend eternity, do you think maybe time is an illusion?
We will get there. That's going to be part of this discussion, actually. That Bill brought up the point that is time an illusion. And that points to this view of atemporality, that maybe time doesn't actually exist, and that God is atemporal, and that maybe even time doesn't exist to us. Maybe it's just subjective perception of things. So that's one view. Again, not putting like beliefs in your mouth, but you're pointing towards basically time being non-existent. That's what that. I'm not saying you believe that, but that's sort of what your question leads to, which is good because we're going to talk about that towards the end of the class.
I would look at time as being
Here.
created.
Yeah.
Okay? So time is realistic for those of us in the creation subjected to the time.
Mm.
So I'm thinking God is not subject to that creation. So I'm thinking that we don't understand eternity because we are subjected to time. When you're not subjected to time, there is no beginning and no end because there is no time.
Because there is no time.
Yeah. So where does that fit?
Yeah.
Okay, so where exactly does that fit? Would that be?
I mean, that would be sort of atemporal.
Similar to where Bill.
Yeah. I mean, that your view on God is that God is outside of time. Like, time doesn't affect God. Yeah. I will give a hint as to, like, my view. I mean, I'm going to sort of expand because I'm going to defend my view. But I sort of think it's a combination of the two. I know I didn't give that as as an option. But before, again, does anybody else have any thoughts, or has anybody thought about this? Does anybody else have?
No, I was going to say the same thing, can it be both? Because God's outside of time, but since we're not, and he's a part of everything we do, that puts him in time also, doesn't it?
Yes, That's a good point. Well, not definitely yes. Like I said, the nice thing about this is that God being eternal is like a Christian doctrine. Like any sort of church you go to across the broad of the 20,000 denominations is going to sort of claim this. But again, there's differences in belief, and none of these are necessarily right or wrong in certain ways. Like I think one is more right than another, and I'll get to that. But anyway, since we had sort of two pointings towards the atemporal view, I'm going to start there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give like an argument that defends God being atemporal or God being outside of time. I'm not going to present these arguments like the philosophical arguments we did last year. I'm just sort of going to go through it. But what I think of the strongest arguments for God being outside of time is that living a temporal life that we live is a terribly incomplete life. Hold on, my thing is falling off. That time is sort of like the great destroyer. That, like, your future is only a potential. Like, you don't know if you'll ever get to your future. You're always sort of looking to the future and waiting for it. And then when the past happens, it's gone. Like tonight, once this class is over, it's gone. So, if you remember what I said when we sort of study these things, we're viewing God as, like, God would have to be the most perfect being. So, to me, that if God lived a temporal life, his life would be sort of incomplete. Like if God was sort of encased within time, that he wouldn't be like a perfect being. Like being outside of time, your life is full all the time. You're living a complete life. All the time is a bad thing to say because God's not in time. But that like God being perfect would have his fullness forever. So again, if he was living and is subject to the past, present, and future, that this somehow would diminish him. A good way sort of to look at it is that in many ways there's this philosophical view called four-dimensionalism, and that we are actually four-dimensional beings. So I shouldn't have erased that, but you look at, this is the timeline, and I'll use myself again, like here I'm born, and then imagine this is my death. And like I'm here right now in this moment, this present moment, but that isn't like all of me. You know, I'm not living. So I'm, in a way, this is my whole life. Like they call it a four-dimensional worm. Like we're actually like these four-dimensional worms, and that we only experience slices of this. Like this is a slice of that existence, and that this whole worm is my whole being. That's my whole existence. And I only am experiencing this one particular time slice, and then this other slice, and this other slice. So a perfect being like God wouldn't have an incomplete existence, you know? Grab the microphone.
Okay, so there's a worm. There's a block of circumstances and existences that you can be in at any time on your timeline. The worm moves as you move on your timeline?
No. The worm is my whole life.
Okay. So if you are born there,
yeah,
but your whole life is the worm that expands from your birth to your death, are you saying that at any time you can experience something that happens towards your death when you're born?
Okay.
Because that's confusing.
Again, you're like Bill, you're pointing to sort of some of the problems with this view. He's getting into what I'm going to get to.
Because that's confusing to me.
And that if God exists outside of time, all time is equal. And that if this is the case, then which part of me is like the real part? Like is my death happening the same time as my birth, as Adam said? Now,
Like watching Lost.
yes. However, I would say, like, so again, you understand that being a temporal being is sort of not perfect. It's incomplete. You know, you think of things that may have happened in your past, regrets, and you can't do anything about it. You know, it's like it's happened, it's gone. Sort of, though, one way to respond to this, that this sort of doesn't affect God if God was to exist within time, is that God's being all-knowing, is that having full knowledge of the future and the past, it's not quite as stinging. Like, it's not, you know, God could, per se, like, totally relive moments in the past because he has full, perfect knowledge of them. It's almost like if we did, you could close your eyes and remember a moment in complete clarity and truthfulness. So again, Adam sort of starting to point to some of the problems with this. But again, I still think that is one of the strongest arguments for God's being atemporal, outside of time, is that he isn't beholden to time. But now I want to get to the other side, God being eternal within time. So, was that a question? Okay. So again, this is the view of God, what we call God being omnitemporal, God being eternal throughout time. And a good argument for this is that God has a changing relation to things within time. Now, God changes his relationship to the temporal world, like to us. Things change. And what this is, you know, we've talked a lot about how God is unchanging, but there are two types of change. One is intrinsic and one is extrinsic. Yeah, sorry about these big words. So intrinsic change is a change that is fundamental to the thing. Like, for example, if an apple goes from green to red because it ages and rots, that's an intrinsic change. Extrinsic is when things change in relation to other things. I thought my brother was going to be here because I was going to use him as an example. But, so, when my brother first met Halima, and she had her daughter Abby, my brother was much taller than Abby. So it could be said that Josiah was taller than Abby. But now, Abby is taller than Josiah. So again, there is a relational change that happened. Nothing changed with my brother. So my brother went through an extrinsic change with Abby because Abby had an intrinsic change. So Abby got taller, so their relation changed. So in this way, God changes with us. Like, we change intrinsically a lot, and then God has an extrinsic change with us. There, you can think of before you were a Christian, and then you became a Christian. There was a change there that happened between you and God. Because something changed in you, your relationship changed with God. So again, this is something that happens in time. This is something that is temporal. Like, you can... I like to do thought experiments. So let's imagine out in space there's a special rock. This rock that is completely unchanging and is eternal. And like nothing happens to it. So in a way it's like, I'm not saying it's like God, but there's an unchanging rock that doesn't change, that's floating in space. And you can say like, oh, okay, it doesn't change, so then it's timeless. But then imagine a meteor shoots by, and then another meteor shoots by. Those two things happened, one happened before the other, and one happened after the other. So even though the rock didn't change, there's still like a temporal change. There's still a time change that happens there. So in a way, I think that this is sort of points to that maybe God is in time. That because of his relational change to us, God has to interact with time. Yes?
Check. But that rock in space is not affected by the meteors going by it.
No. But it doesn't mean that the rock is timeless. Because
I don't understand.
Because there's still before and then after. Like before the meteor and then after the meteor. Before the second meteor and then after the second meteor. If God is outside of time, or if this rock was timeless, like both those things would be like now. There would be no before and after.
But But the rock is the center.
Yes. The rock had an extrinsic change. Changed. So I'm saying if the thing is, I think you're thinking that God is atemporal, but but you want him to be atemporal and then also in the universe. God being atemporal means that all time is equal to God. Like, so if God is atemporal, there's no difference between this point and this point because God is outside. So it's all the same.
That would be very difficult to do.
So maybe that's just I didn't explain it well enough.
No, I get it now.
So if something exists outside of time, every moment in time is the same. There is no difference. So it could say that if God existed outside of time, you couldn't ask God, what time is it right now? God wouldn't be able to answer that question.
So, as the rock, God would see all meteors going by at the same time.
Yes and no.
Oh, gosh, this is hard.
Yeah.
Because would the meteors be moving? Right, that's what I'm saying.
But
If
to the
they're-
rock, are they moving?
Right, is the rock just seeing a bunch of still things then?
I don't know.
Because if there's no time, then nothing is moving because nothing is changing.
Yeah. There is no beginning, there is no after. Everything is just,
Frozen.
yeah. But not frozen. That's atemporality.
Yeah.
But if God exists, but if
Hello.
So
Hold the mic up.
can't they exist simultaneously? So, I mean, God exists outside of time, atemporally. We're subject to time here, but that doesn't necessarily mean that time is not. I don't see how they can't coexist.
Let me get to his question first. Okay, I mean, when you say it like that, but then how can God exist both outside of time and in time at the same time? You see, like when you start to think about it and phrase it that way, it's like you start to get into these contradictions.
Maybe not necessarily existing, well, just not subject to time. Would that be
Yes.
be eternal?
That doesn't mean that he's atemporal. You know, the effects of time aren't. God isn't necessarily subject to them. Doesn't mean he is then outside of time. So the question is, I could ask, like, do you believe that the future? I was going to ask you a question, Joe, so you might need the microphone. So the question then is, do you believe that the future is real? Like, do you believe the future has happened already? Like, do you think the things in the future already exist? Or do you think that they're yet to happen?
I think that for us they are yet to happen, but potentially for someone outside of time, perhaps they have access to all that.
Okay. Now, the thing I think some people might be confusing is I don't want you to confuse God's knowledge of future events with those future events being real. So that could be the confusion, like God could...
Right now, already.
You gotta grab the mic, but...
What's happening now?
But let's give it to Bill.
Your question might be better.
Hello?
Yeah.
That was like Joe's hello. Hello?
You could have chosen an easier subject to talk on, I'll tell you, but it's very interesting. We're speaking in the English language, and it's... Yo hablo en español.
And it sometimes seems when either you're talking or someone else here is talking about time, it seems rather restrictive because for me, time is I look at a clock, or it's time to go somewhere, or it happened back in time, and now current thinking seems to say that there is no past, there is no future, there's only now, and some people will even argue that there's an even now, especially if everything is eternal. And so, did that sound like a question?
I mean, I could try to dig a question out of there.
I think, well, I think it's because of my own confusion, because I'm using the English word time, and that means a specific thing to me.
I will say, like, you brought up something that where you said, like, you view time as, like, you know, the hands on the clock.
Yeah.
And there is many different ways to measure time. There is a physical, scientifically measured value of time, which is like we can measure time in seconds, minutes, hours, picoseconds, and that science can measure this, and science can measure that if you're moving at an accelerated rate, time moves differently. Like if I was moving at the speed of light, it would appear that I age much slower than you age. However, a second is still like a second to you, a second is still a second to me, no matter what speed we're moving at. But however, there is another aspect of time, which I said last week, that time can also just be a measure of change. Once one event happens and another event happens. So even there's like what they call mental time. If you have one thought and then you have a different thought, there's a change there. So that is also an aspect of time. Now, I wouldn't measure that by like, oh, seconds and minutes, but yeah, but there is something that once something changes, there is something that we call time has occurred. Sean has a question.
Couldn't the word duration clear some confusion about that, different use of the word time? Like the measure of seconds is more of duration than the actual concept of time.
It could be. I mean, we could just say intervals. That's why I like to use change. Like any time something has changed, that then time has come into effect. You know, we also talk about time like we're talking about it subject, like as a subject, where time could just be a descriptor of the way things work. Okay.
For the omnitemporal, what is time defined as? Like, what's the beginning of time? The beginning of the earth, or?
So the beginning of like if you're going to say that, I mean, we can just for the sake of this, that would be the creation of the universe, creation of existence, or like the Big Bang. Like when God said, "Let there be light," that's when sort of time started.
But God existed before that, so how can he be omnitemporal if he, right? Didn't you say that God exists within himself, like he already existed before everything else existed?
And that's where like you're sort of getting to where I think that's a combination of the two.
Okay. And for the other one, why does it have to be like frozen? Why can't it just be that he's not in time, so he sees everything like almost happening all at once, or kind of like he can see the past and the present and the future all? You know what I mean? Like someone said something before about it being frozen, but that doesn't make sense to me.
But again, then it's more of a view of like being omnitemporal. Like atemporal would mean that, like I said, God is outside of time, so he would in a sense be sort of frozen. Because if there is no time, God doesn't change in relation to things. Because like I said, remember, time is a measure of change.
So if he's outside of time, he can't change in relation to us.
I mean, that's what I think, if God is atemporal. Again, I'm not saying I'm right. That's just like sort of my view.
But isn't that why you're teaching the class? To tell us what's right? Just kidding. Okay, that's all. Sorry for
Okay, so I'll start to another one of my sort of problems with God being atemporal or my view of God being outside of time is, like I said, all these events, past, present, and future, are sort of equal to God. It's all the same. But then I think that diminishes the incarnation. Like the incarnation, then the crucifixion, and then the resurrection isn't anything special to God. Like, since it's all equal, it's all happening at the same time. Quote, I keep saying that, but just so I clarify. I will get into, since we've been sort of talking about this a lot, there are two theories of time and how we understand time, and we've been talking about both of them. And I'm not lying when I say this, that the theories of time are called the A theory of time and the B theory of time. That's their names. The A theory of time is what's called the tense theory of time, and that is sort of the common sense experience. That's how we understand time. There's a past, there's a present, there's a future. Things happen in events. Once something happens, it's in the past. It no longer exists. And, that's how we experience time. And when I say it's the common sense theory, that's sort of how we experience it. Now there is the B theory of time, which goes more in line with God being atemporal. The B theory of time, and what sort of Bill hinted at, actually no, there's no arrows on this. So this is a B theory of time. This is all of time. And that these things we talk about, past, present, future, that these things are just illusions. That time exists equally throughout. So 1951 is just as equal as right now. That 1951 now is happening right now. If there was a way to go to 1951, it would just be now. It doesn't cease to exist when it's in the past. And this is like what's called the B theory of time. That past and the future are just sort of subjective illusions. And so this theory would more allow God to exist outside of time. So you could have God up here, and then all of time happening here. And then this would be all of time. This is like our universe. God is out here, and you can sort of see everything because it's all equal. Instead of saying something happened in the past, it would be more like a point on the line. Like at X, this happened, at X, this happened, but they're both equally happening now. Again, hard to understand that.
That would make time travel.
Yes, exactly. If you want to believe in time travel, you have to hold to this theory of time.
You could go back at any time to a different,
Correct.
if that were.
Unless you're Stephen Hawking, because you can't go back, but you can go forward. Which is very simple. Turn the room around and reverse it.
So, again, this is what's called the B theory of time. It's called the tenseless theory of time. And I think that if you want to hold that God is atemporal, that you have to sort of hold to this theory. Let me sort of get to what I think, in that I think before creation, God was atemporal. But God did not exist in time. There was no time. And then once he created something, that instituted a change, and then there's time sort of happened. Something happened, a change happened, and God sort of entered into time with the creation. And that's what I sort of mean by both. God doesn't exist outside of time, but he isn't sort of subject to time, especially in his knowledge. I do think that in the tense theory, I do ascribe to it that I think things in the past have happened and they're gone, they're over, the past is done. And I do think the future hasn't happened yet. It doesn't mean, like I said, in terms of I think Joe was pointing to, that God knows the future. God knows what's going to happen. God knows what's going to happen even potentially. I think that we look at sort of decisions we can make, and then if we make this decision, this would happen. If we make this decision, this would happen. I think God would know either way, what would happen in any instance. So I think some people may be like thinking of God being outside of time more in that sense, that you're thinking, well, God, the future is real to God. But in my view, it's not real that it's happening right now. The future isn't happening right now. And as a Christian, I think the reason I hold on to this view is because I think if everything is happening, or again, even talking about this is frustrating, so trust me, if everything is equally real and equally now, this diminishes so many things that I think happen throughout history, especially as Christians, the crucifixion and the resurrection. Like if everything is now, that means Christ is still being crucified right now, if it's equal.
And resurrecting.
Right now.
At the same time.
At the same time. So in many ways, it becomes sort of meaningless. And that also means prior to the resurrection and crucifixion is equally real. So there was a time where there is no, quote-unquote, salvation for sin existing right now. So that's sort of why, as a Christian, I think you can't really hold to this theory, in my opinion. But like I said, you still can. This is something that is debated, like in Christian philosophers still disagree over this. The world and science still disagrees over this. People don't like to talk about time because it can hurt your head. But again, one of the qualities of God is God being eternal. I don't think we'll ever fully be able to understand that. I think my dad brought up that, like, oh, maybe once we die and go to heaven, we'll have an understanding of it. And I still don't think we'll have a full understanding of it, or we'll fully be able to comprehend it. We won't care.
Now we care. So that would also mean
Too, that Jesus is returning now.
Yes.
And we are already in heaven
Yes.
now. And that does.
Yeah, and that, to me, it sort of also diminishes, your relationship with God. But again, I think that a merging of the two views is possible. You just have to be careful when you say God is both outside of time and inside of time. You have to be careful. I think I understand what you mean. Like, you're thinking like God is inside of time, he's subject to these physical laws of time, and that's not what I mean. I mean, this idea of change being a sort of time is a measure of change, that God is sort of changing with us on a daily basis, extrinsically, not intrinsically. But, when you are suffering or you need prayer or you want prayer or you're asking God for help, that God is changing with you in that. Like, his nature isn't changing. But so if God is outside of time, these sort of things don't really mean anything to God. I mean, it's all the same. So I think that sort of diminishes a lot. And so that's why sort of I hold the view I hold, and I don't hold to the B theory of time. I was hoping Tommy would be here because he really likes to talk about time travel, and I don't think time travel is possible. Because Dave has to say something.
Yeah, whenever Tommy does that, it drives me crazy. So I really like what you said, because before God created anything, I mean, time's just a concept that we have, and so we measure time really. As soon as the planet started spinning, we had time, because then it spun one time around as one day. But before the planets were created, there was nothing happening. And time is just an illusion of what we say, well, this happened, and this hasn't happened. And so, yeah, God created things, and so then time became just a concept of things that happened.
Yes, I think time is much more conceptually than an actual thing. I think, like I said, once things started to change, that's what time, like, I don't think God was like, all right, I'm going to create time, and then I'm going to put these beings in it. I just think it's just a descriptor. The same way I view mathematics. I don't, like, people will, sorry to go off on a tangent, but there are people who think that the number 2 is an actual thing, where I think the number 2 is just a descriptor. Like God, because they were like, oh, well, you'll hear like, the number 1 had to exist before God existed, because if there was one God, what came first, the number 1 or God? And I don't think the number 1 isn't a thing. It's just sort of a way to describe something. And I think time is the same way. Time is just sort of a way to measure change or when change happens, but I do think that the present is what's real and the future is yet to happen. But I do think that when we get into omniscience, God's knowledge, we will talk about this more.
The only other thing I'll add is that when Jesus was leaving, the disciples asked him when he was coming back in Acts 1, and he said, it's not for you to know the time or the seasons that it's going to happen. So he didn't say it's already happened, you know. So.
Does anybody have more questions or confused about stuff? Does like sort of the merging of the two views make sense, Linda?
I kind of thought there was something between what you just said, but we do enter into an eternity. There's a portal for us through what Jesus did on the cross to enter into eternity. Just like from the very beginning, there were two trees in the garden. One was eternal.
Yeah.
One would offer us to walk into an eternity mode with God. And he said, lest they live forever, let's get them out of the garden, because now they've eaten of the fruit and they know good from evil, so we don't want them to be eternal. Now the eternity only comes to us through Christ. So
yeah, I mean, we have
both had to have existed.
We have an eternal soul.
Right.
Like Dave talks about the soul a lot. We have an eternal soul. But I think more of it is like that eternity that God is existing in, that is right now. Like God is existing eternally right now. And I think more of it, I don't view it as sort of this separate, like here is our space-time, here is our time, and then God is out here, and eventually we'll enter this portal. I think that this is all existence, and we're only a tiny little part of it. I don't think there's a separate. I think God sees all of it. God is in all of it, and we are only in this little part of it, rather than thinking of them as being separate. That there isn't like, oh, God is outside of time and we're in time. I think we're just in a fraction of all of reality.
Can I ask your opinion on it?
Personal question? Okay, we'll see. Depends on how deep you want me to get.
Well, I don't think the human mind will probably ever be able to understand. That's the only word I can come up with. And what we're talking about, like eternity, the human mind is not developed enough to grasp that. Is it possible to make our lives easier? God is letting us divide time into past, present, and future? Since our minds
Let me
are...
sort of think of a different way to ask that. Like that you think that just to comprehend reality,
to
we
live
were
our
sort of
lives.
made this way.
To make our lives
I don't think he made... I think part of the reason that I said time is sort of the terrible destroyer, and I think Linda was I think that part of the consequence of like rejecting God is that we are now subject to time. We are now sort of subject to the past sort of erasing away like the things we've had. It's hard to answer. It's hard to like, I think actually one time in sort of a private conversation, Linda sort of asked me what I conceived heaven to be like, or like living outside a physical body, like to be like, and it's hard, you can't really picture it. You can't. The best way personally, to me, I try to understand it is that I think of like moments in my life where you'll hear phrases like, oh, time seemed to fly, or I didn't realize what time it was, time stood still, and these are sort of the moments in our life where we're like sort of the most happy, the most content, where time doesn't seem to matter. And I sort of think of being outside of this is like that. Like time sort of becomes meaningless to us. Not that it's not there, it's just sort of inconsequential because like we're just content. And I think that is sort of a way to understand it. For me personally, that's how I understand it. But yeah, like you said, there's an aspect of this that we'll never be able to comprehend. All right, anybody else? Because I think that's it for tonight, but I'm willing to talk as much as possible about this stuff.
Was the Garden of Eden eternal? Was it a measurement of time, or do you think the measurement, because there was movement in the Garden of Eden, let's say, so do you think that even right then we were subject to time? Because I'm thinking maybe we weren't, yet there was still movement.
Well, again, I think you're sort of still thinking of time as these sort of minutes, days. I think that the Garden of Eden, like, was in time. Like, eternal doesn't mean outside of time. I think that's sort of what you're thinking. Like, eternal just means that, because like I said, time is just changing. Like, Adam and Eve were sort of having a relationship with God, so there was change. So yes, they were in time, but again, that doesn't mean they weren't eternal. You know, because the eternal could just mean, like I said, infinite throughout time. And I think that's sort of, I think once creation started, like when God said, "Let there be light," and time, quote unquote, started, I think it started and it is going to go for eternity. Yes, I don't think there is an end to time, unless God decides to erase all existence. Which he wouldn't do, because when we get to more his other attributes, we'll know why he wouldn't do that.
All right, good.